At dinner, my nephew looked across the table at my 7-year-old son and said, "Only real grandchildren get their food first." No one corrected him. My mother actually smiled. I took my son by the hand, walked out, got into my car, and drove away. That night, my dad texted me, "Rent is due." I replied, "Then start paying it yourself." And the family group chat exploded. I'd had a bad feeling on the drive over. It was a dinner to celebrate my parents' 35th wedding anniversary, and of course, they had insisted on celebrating it at that obscenely expensive downtown steakhouse. Stiff, formal, where, fake smiles, forced conversation. My son, Holden, had just turned 7. He had wanted to wear his light-up Spider-Man sneakers. I let him. I knew it would likely irritate my mother. We hadn't even fully stepped into the private dining area when I saw how the table was arranged, long and rectangular. My parents in the center, my sister, Marlo and her husband Vance on the right, and their son Beckett right at the head of the table. A special spot had been prepared for him, the seat my parents, always reserved for the guest of honor, or, in Beckett's case, their favorite human being on the planet. Holden and I were relegated to the far end of the table. As usual, no one stood up to greet us. No one said they were glad we came. I kissed my dad on the salon cheek. Mom made some offhand comment about how tall Holden was getting. Beckett didn't even look up from his iPad. The waiter came over, took drink orders, and handed out menus. I ordered Holden a lemonade. He quietly asked if he could get chicken nuggets. And then it happened. Beckett finally looked up, stared right at Holden, and loudly, clearly said, "Only real grandchildren get their food first." He delivered it like he was stating an obvious fact, explaining the rules of gravity to a toddler. Nobody said a word. Not Marlo, who pretended to be deeply engrossed in the appetizers list. Not her husband Vance, who just raised his eyebrows and stared into his wine glass like it had suddenly become the most fascinating thing in the room. My dad didn't even blink, and my mom, she smiled. It was that tight, smug little smirk she always wore whenever Beckett said something she deemed clever. I looked at Holden. He wasn't crying, but I could see the weight of it crushing him all at once. Confusion, shame, pain, and something far worse, resignation. He wasn't even surprised. Things like this had happened before, not with those exact words, but with the exact same implication, and no one ever corrected Beckett, because deep down, they all agreed with him. I stood up, took Holden's hand, pulled a couple of $20 bills out of my purse, and dropped them next to my untouched water glass. Mom asked where I was going, but I didn't answer. Dad glared at me, then buried his face back in his menu. We walked out in silence. In the car, Holden quietly asked, "Are we not family?" I told him no. I told him we didn't belong anywhere that made him feel small, and that sharing blood didn't automatically mean respect. He nodded. He always understood more than a 7-year-old ever should. On the way home, we hit a drive-thru and got burgers. He fell asleep before I even finished cleaning up the kitchen. At 9:30 p.m., I got a text from my dad. 3 words. "Rent is due." No, hello. No, how are you? Just a blunt reminder that they still viewed me as an ATM. I had been quietly paying Marlo's rent for over a year. They always told everyone she was just going through a rough patch, completely ignoring the fact that I was the one holding her life together with duct tape. I was the one who made sure her kids had presents under the tree on Christmas morning. I was the one who paid for the emergency plumber when her pipes burst, and my reward was sitting there watching her son humiliate mine. I stared at the text for a few minutes, then typed back, "Then start paying it yourself." The silence lasted exactly 10 minutes, and then the group chat erupted. "Mom, what on earth are you talking about? Marlo, Delaney, what the hell? Dad, are you seriously pulling this stunt today of all days? Vance, real classy, Delaney." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. They didn't realize it yet, but this wasn't just me causing drama. This was my final awakening, and it was only the beginning. By morning, there were over 40 unread messages in the group chat. I didn't open a single one. I made Holden pancakes, packed his lunch, and dropped him off at elementary school like it was a completely normal Tuesday. But inside, something had permanently snapped. Not with a bang, not in a fiery explosion, just quietly, the way a branch snaps under a heavy blanket of snow. It's held up for too long. I knew who I was the night before. I was never going back to being her. Around noon, Marlo called. I let it ring out. Then came the text. "Are you seriously refusing to pay the rent? You know we can't cover it this month." I left it on red. 5 minutes later, another one. This is all over Beckett's. Joke? He's just a kid, Delaney. Grow up. I could have reminded her that it wasn't the first time, that Beckett had made comments before about how Holden didn't look like them, that he wasn't a real cousin. I had brought it up every single time, and every time Marlo waved it off. My parents would change the subject, and Vance would play deaf. And Beckett learned the most important lesson of all. Nobody was ever going to stop him. That humiliating my son was perfectly fine as long as you did it with a smirk and a shrug. It wasn't about the joke. It was about years of watching my child get bruised while being told I was imagining things. At 3:07 p.m., my mom called. I picked up. She didn't ask how Holden was doing. She didn't ask why I walked out. She launched straight into a lecture about how I had embarrassed the family, how shocked Marlo was, and how my reaction was entirely disproportionate. I waited for her to pause for breath, and then I spoke clearly. I am no longer funding their lifestyle. Not for Marlo, not for anyone, not a single dollar. She huffed and said I was punishing the wrong people. I didn't even bother, replying, I just hung up. That evening, Holden was curled up next to me on the sofa. We had some cartoon playing in the background, but he was barely watching it. Halfway through the episode, he looked up and asked, "Why does Beckett hate me?" I told him the truth, or at least the version of it his young mind could carry. I told him that sometimes people say mean things because they feel tiny inside, and that it had absolutely nothing to do with him. He nodded slowly, but I could see the question still sitting like a heavy stone in his chest. It was stuck in, mine too. 3 days passed. Radio silence from my family. Then Marlo finally texted. Again. This time it was a screenshot of an eviction warning from her leasing office. Bright red lettering, final notice stamped across the top. No words, just the picture. A minute later, a text followed. Hope you're happy. You just made your nephew homeless. There it was. The guilt trip. A loaded, weaponized phrase designed to shift entire burden onto me. Onto me, not the 2 grown adults whose names were actually on the lease. Onto me, not the parents who let Beckett grow up thinking cruelty was a substitute for wit. I was always supposed to be the villain in their narrative, except this time. Not this time. I didn't text back. Instead, I opened my laptop. For the next hour, I sifted through old bank transfers, digital receipts, and screenshots of texts where Marlo practically begged me not to tell our parents about her maxed out credit. Cards. Years of hard evidence proving I had been carrying the financial weight of 2 households. I saved everything into a folder on my desktop, not because I planned to use it, but to remind myself of the absolute truth in case I ever started to waver. I skipped Sunday dinner. Mom sent a single question mark into the group chat. Dad followed it up with a thumbs up emoji. It was their way of projecting calm, pretending I hadn't disturbed the waters at all. I ignored them. Instead, I took Holden to the local park. He climbed the jungle gym and laughed. For the first time in weeks, I saw him relaxed, truly, completely relaxed. But the quiet didn't last. Sunday night, I got a text from Vance. He had never texted me privately before. It started off awkwardly formal, something about how they had spoken to Beckett about his behavior and that they understood my frustration. Then came the pivot. But you know we can't make rent without your help. It's not fair to take this out on the kids. I sat with that message for a long time because it was finally happening. For years, I had been the airbag, the emergency fund, the structural beam they all leaned on so they wouldn't have to lean on each other. And the moment I stepped out of the equation, the entire house of cards began to wobble. And the truth was, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. By the end of the week, they realized I wasn't bluffing. The silence I blanketed them with wasn't malicious. It wasn't fueled by rage. It was just complete no. Replies, no follow-ups, no justifications. And they had no idea how to handle. They were used to me caving within 48 hours. A little. Guilt-tripping here, a passive-aggressive phone call there, and I'd be back to covering Marlo's rent or bailing her out of her latest disaster. Not this time, Marlo cracked first. She sent a massive wall of text late. Thursday night, a messy salad of excuses and half-baked apologies, she claimed. Beckett didn't mean what he said, that he was just a kid, that maybe he was, acting out because things were tense at home. She suggested Holden could come over for a play date to smooth things over. And then came the part she just couldn't help adding. Mom and Dad are really stressed out right now. Everything is falling on them, and it's just not fair. I had to read that line twice, because for the first time in years, it was actually true. For the first time, the fallout wasn't landing on me. You see, my parents always existed on the perimeter of responsibility, involved enough to judge, but never enough to actually sacrifice anything. But now that I had officially tapped out, everything they had successfully avoided, the rent, the bills, the relentless stress of Marlowe's chaotic life crashed squarely onto their shoulders. They didn't want it, but they no longer had a choice. A few days of silence followed, and then Marlowe lost her job. Fired without warning, corporate restructuring, no severance package, absolutely no safety net. Just a severed paycheck and a looming eviction notice. Vance lasted exactly 1 week longer. Then came the layoffs at his logistics company. Same story. Suddenly, both of them were unemployed. No income, zero savings, and no Delaney to call for a bailout, and that was when my parents had to step in. For the first time in decades, they actually had to help. But here was the catch. They couldn't afford it. They loved projecting the image of wealthy suburbanites, but it was entirely a facade. Country club dues, Sunday brunches, trips to Sedona they could barely keep up with on their credit cards. These were people who would drop $200 on dinner while aggressively ignoring a $400 utility bill. So when a $1,900 rent payment fell into their laps, it drew blood. Mom called me that same night. Her voice was trembling, though she tried to sound casual. But the sheer panic bled through every syllable. She said Marlowe was going through a catastrophic period and that family needs to stick together. I said, no. She paused, then pleaded that it was just for this month, that she and Dad were stretched incredibly thin, and that I knew how hard the economy was right now. I said no again. She tried one last desperate guilt trip, claiming Holden would want to help his cousin if he understood what was happening. I didn't even dignify that with a response. I just ended the call. That night, Marlowe sent me one last text. No preamble, just another screenshot of the final eviction notice with a single sentence underneath. Are you really going to make us homeless? No, I wasn't making anyone homeless. I was simply refusing to finance the lives of people who simultaneously kept themselves afloat by drowning my child. I had paid my dues. I had bailed them out more times than I could count, covered rent, utilities, even bought Beckett's back-to-school supplies when Marlowe forgot. I did it all quietly, never asking for a single thing in return except basic human respect for Holden, and they couldn't even manage that. So now, for the first time, they had to survive without me. I didn't text back, but I knew what was happening behind the curtain. That month, my parents paid Marlowe's rent. It nearly broke them. I saw the cracks in the little things. Mom canceled her bi-weekly standing appointment at the upscale nail salon. Dad skipped his annual golf weekend in Scottsdale. They abruptly stopped posting about their upcoming anniversary trip. The curated vacation photos dried up. The facade was crumbling. Then the dynamic shifted. My dad, who literally never texted me unless he was annoyed, suddenly sent a message. This situation is unsustainable. That was it. No greeting, no question. Just a statement, delivered as if it were still my problem to solve. I ignored it. Then Vance texted. It was almost comical. He tried to play the role of the rational peacemaker. He claimed Beckett felt terrible he didn't, that this wasn't about money, it absolutely was, and that everyone was just having a hard time. Then came the fatal line. You were always the responsible one, we thought. You'd understand. That was their biggest miscalculation. They assumed my silence all those years meant consent. They thought I actually liked being the fixer, that I didn't have a breaking point. They were dead wrong, because now they were the ones cleaning up the mess. They were the ones choosing between groceries and property taxes. They were the ones keeping Marlowe's life on life support while their own slowly withered. And me? I was fine. I was paying my own bills, taking Holden to the park, eating peaceful dinners. I finally had the one thing they could never offer me while I was chained to their chaos. Freedom. For about 2 weeks, things got quiet. Too quiet. No frantic texts. No weaponized guilt trips. No dramatic voicemails. It almost felt like they had accepted reality. I should have known better. My family never adapted. They manipulated. The curveball came from Beckett. Not directly, but through Holden. One day after school, Holden told me a boy had said hi to him at the parent pickup line. He hesitated before saying the name Beckett. Turns out, Marlowe had abruptly transferred him to a new school district because They were now spending every weekday at my parents' house to save on gas and groceries. This was news to me. No one told me he had moved schools. Holden said Beckett had told him something weird. Beckett said Grandma told him that Aunt Delaney was just angry because she hated her family, that Aunt Delaney didn't want Beckett to have food to eat, that Aunt Delaney stole money that was supposed to belong to him. Holden looked at me with big eyes and asked if it was true. That was the moment I realized exactly what their game plan was. They weren't just panicking anymore. They were actively rewriting history. That night, I finally opened the muted group chat. What I read made my stomach turn. Screenshots taken entirely out of context. Marlo claiming I had sworn a blood oath to support them forever. Mom expressing deep, fake concern about my mental breakdown. Dad insinuating I was recklessly blowing my savings. They were no longer begging for a bailout. They were laying the groundwork to paint me as unstable. And then came the real shocker. I got a voicemail from an unknown number. A polite, highly professional woman introduced herself as a caseworker from the County Department of Family Services, CPS. She stated that my name had come up regarding some financial disputes and child welfare concerns, and that she needed to clarify a few things. I didn't panic. I actually laughed out loud in my empty kitchen. Everything clicked into place. They weren't just losing control. They were so wildly desperate that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. I called the number back and cleared the entire thing up in 10 minutes. I explained calmly that I did not live with them, shared no finances with them, and had simply stopped voluntarily funding my sister's household. I offered to email her a PDF of my organized receipts, bank statements, and the timeline of texts. The caseworker thanked me, sounding highly exasperated with whoever had filed the report, and said my documentation was more than enough. Case closed. 2 hours later, my dad called. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't lecturing, he sounded terrified. He asked if I had spoken to anyone official today. I said yes. He went dead silent, then stammered that Marlo had just been asking for advice and that things had been completely misunderstood. I told him in a voice as cold as ice that they had crossed a boundary they would never, ever be able to uncross. And that was when he finally broke and confessed the truth. They were drowning. That $1,900 rent had detonated their budget. They were defaulting on their own utility bills. Their credit cards were completely maxed out. Their savings were gone. The retirement fund had been tapped. The luxury vacations they treasured were canceled indefinitely. And Beckett? He was no longer playing the role of the golden grandchild. He was throwing tantrums, lashing out, and saying horrific things to kids at his new school. Teachers were calling home. Suddenly, the behavior they had spent years laughing off wasn't so cute when they were the ones dealing with the fallout 24/7. Mom called right after him. She was sobbing. Real, ugly tears. She kept saying they didn't mean for it to go this far, that they thought I would just cool off, that they honestly had no idea how much I was actually handling behind the scenes. That was the most shocking part. They finally admitted it out loud. They didn't. No, I told her I believed her, but that it changed absolutely nothing, because the damage was done. They had tried to weaponize a government agency and turn my own child against me. That wasn't something I was ever going to forget. The week Marlo and Vance finally got evicted and moved into my parents' suburban house, the group chat died completely. Not a single word from anyone. No fake pleasantries. No pretending things were fine. Just silence. The kind of silence that hangs in the air when a building is mid-collapse, right before the dust hits the streets. I didn't reach out. I already knew what was happening. 5 people were now crammed under one roof. Marlo, Vance, Beckett, and my parents. 5 people who had spent years constructing a funhouse of mirrors where I was the villain and Beckett was the untouchable prince. Now they were trapped in it together, with nowhere to hide from the mess they had created. Through a mutual friend, I heard that Marlo hadn't even unpacked her boxes. Before the screaming matches started, Beckett was having meltdowns daily. My parents were constantly fighting with Vance about the grocery bill, the electricity, the noise, everything. Their pristine, quiet house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a pressure cooker. One weekend, Dad texted me out of the blue. Got a minute? I ignored it. The next day, he tried again. Things are spiraling out of control here. Can we please talk? I left it on red. It wasn't about revenge anymore. I just didn't trust myself. Not to say something that would burn the bridge to ashes. I had zero desire to hear about how tired they were. I had been bone tired for years, and they hadn't cared. I wasn't going to help them navigate a disaster they built while pretending my pain didn't exist. But then Holden came home from school with a question. He asked why Beckett had told him they might not have a Christmas this year. I froze. It was early November, way too early for kids to be stressing about Christmas. But apparently, during a brief passing at the school gates, Beckett had told Holden that Santa was going to skip their house because they were poor. Now, I gently asked Holden what else Beckett had said. Holden looked down at his shoes and said Beckett had been crying at the grandparents' house, that he was angry all the time, that he kept screaming that nothing was fair and that nobody loved him anymore. Holden wasn't gloating. He actually looked heartbroken for him. That was the moment I realized the paradigm hadn't just shifted. It had. Completely shattered. They were all in pure survival mode now. The illusion of superiority was dead. Even Beckett, who had spent his entire short life sitting at the top of their toxic little food chain, no longer had a pedestal to look down from. The next day, I agreed to meet my dad at a local diner. Neutral territory. No family photos on the walls. No childhood nostalgia. Just bad drip coffee and cold toast. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a full night in months. And for the first time in my 32 years of life, he didn't start the conversation with a lecture or a guilt trip. He asked how Holden was doing, genuinely listened to the answer, and then he said it. Not a half apology, not a passive-aggressive, "I'm sorry you felt that way." He looked me dead in the eye and said, "We failed you." He admitted they had enabled Marlo to the point of ruin. He admitted they didn't want to deal with her chaos, so they outsourced it to me. He confessed that whenever Beckett said vile things, they looked the other way because confronting it meant dealing with Marlo's tantrums. They had convinced themselves I was made of iron, that I could handle endless abuse as long as they didn't have to get their hands dirty. Then he laid out the financial reality. Mom had drained her 401 kick. Dad had missed a credit card payment for the first time in 20 years. They were paying for Beckett's clothes, the groceries, the gas, everything. Marlo still refused to get a job, claiming she was too stressed, and Vance was barely looking. Every time my parents pushed them, it ended in a screaming match. They weren't a family anymore. They were hostile roommates who despised each other. And then came the sentence that finally hit the bone. "We're carrying it all. Now, Delaney. And we only just realized how impossibly heavy it was for you." We sat in silence for a long time while the waitress refilled our mugs. He finally asked if I could ever forgive them. I told him I didn't know yet. I explained that it was never really about the money or even the years of emotional manipulation. It was about Holden. It was about how they allowed a child they idolized to systematically demean my child. How they smiled while it happened, stayed perfectly silent, and expected me to smile right along with them. Dad nodded. He swallowed hard and said Mom wanted to talk too. He said they were both deeply ashamed, that their lives were falling apart faster than they could patch the holes, and that for the first time in their lives, they were genuinely terrified of the future. I looked at him and calmly said, "I'm not fixing it. Not this time, and not ever." Again, he nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "We're not asking you to. We just needed you to know that we finally see it." That was it. I threw a 20 on the table to cover my half of the check and the tip. He didn't argue. As we walked out to the parking lot, he turned to me and said quietly, "We'll try to be better. If you ever decide to give us a chance." I didn't make any promises, but I didn't slam the door in his face either. Sometimes it isn't about whether someone deserves a second chance. It's about whether they actually know what to do with it. Thanksgiving arrived. I didn't get an invitation. No text from Mom, no passive-aggressive email from Marlo, nothing in the group chat. I knew they were having dinner anyway, they always did. But this year, I wasn't part of the play. No one had to set a separate plate for Holden at the far end of the table. There was no pretending we were a happy family. I had taken myself off the board, and for the first time, they didn't try to drag me back on. Holden and I spent a quiet Thursday at home, just the two of us. He helped me mash the potatoes. We baked a store-bought pie, dumped way too much cinnamon on it because that's how we liked it, and watched classic animated movies until he fell asleep wrapped in a blanket on the couch. The silence in the house didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. A few days later, Mom texted me. Not about the holidays, not about Marlo, just one sentence. "Can we please talk?" I agreed, but strictly on my terms. I told her she could come over, but she had to come alone. I wasn't going to get ambushed into a group let's hug and forget session where I was expected to sweep my trauma under the rug. She showed up on a Sunday afternoon. No makeup, no dramatic jewelry. She looked older, not from age, but from the distinct kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones when reality finally shatters your denial. She didn't bring anything, not even a peace-offering pastry, which honestly put me at ease. Holden was at a friend's house, so we sat in the living room. I didn't offer her coffee. I just waited. She started slow. She said things at their house had escalated. Vance had walked out 3 days ago without a word. He left a note on the kitchen counter saying he needed space, and no one had heard from him since. Marlo was practically catatonic, refusing to leave her childhood bedroom. Beckett was completely out of control, screaming, refusing to do his homework, breaking things, and my parents were staring down the barrel of a financial crisis they couldn't outrun. Pensions frozen, savings decimated. And then she said something that actually pierced my armor. "I don't want you to be happy about this," she whispered. "I don't want you to look at our misery and think, good, now they know. But I won't lie to you. Delaney, we know. God, we know now." She admitted that she finally understood how utterly alone I had been in my assigned role. The designated fixer, the one who absorbed the blows, stayed quiet and spun straw into gold just to keep the family afloat. She said she used to mistake my silence for strength. Now she recognized it for what it actually was: profound, isolating exhaustion. She cried quietly. Not the loud, theatrical sobs designed to manipulate pity, but the silent, heavy tears that leak out when you can't run from your own guilt anymore. She cried when she talked about Holden. She said she had been lying, awake at night, thinking about how he must have felt sitting at that steakhouse, hearing he wasn't real, while the woman who was supposed to protect him just smiled. "It haunts me," she said, her voice cracking. "Not just that we let it happen, but because we all knew exactly what Beckett meant, and we chose him over Holden. Anyway, it was the very first time she hadn't tried to spin it as a misunderstanding. She wiped her face and asked if there was a path forward, not backward to how things were, but forward. I told her maybe, but it wouldn't be fast. I told her I was done being convenient. I was done being the backup plan, the emotional dumping ground, and the emergency debit card in the family group chat. If they wanted any place in my life or Holden's life, they were going to have to come to the table with respect. Real respect proven through actions, not tearful speeches in my living room. She nodded. "I'll try." I told her I believed she meant it, but that I also wouldn't forget how much collateral damage it took for her to finally wake up. Right before she left, she hovered by the front door and asked if she could see Holden soon. I told her I would have to ask him first. That was the new rule. No. More decisions made behind his back, forcing him into rooms where he wasn't valued. If he wanted distance, he would get it. If he wanted to see them, they would have to earn his time. She nodded without a hint of resistance. A quiet goodbye, and she walked to her car. I locked the door behind her. There was no massive wave of relief, no cinematic crying fit against the wood of the door, just a strange, settling calm, the kind of calm that washes over you when you realize you've survived the storm and you never have to fight that particular battle again. Weeks passed. Mom started texting occasionally. Nothing heavy, no trauma dumping. About Marlo, just checking in. Dad even sent a photo once, an old Polaroid of Holden and Beckett as toddlers, playing with wooden blocks on their living room rug. I didn't reply to it. I wasn't quite ready for nostalgia, but I didn't delete the photo either. Then came Christmas. A package arrived in the mail for Holden. It wasn't extravagant or showy, just a modest, thoughtful gift with a handwritten card, signed by both my parents, saying they missed him and were incredibly proud of the young man he was becoming. I handed it to him and let him decide what to do with it. He opened it, read the card, smiled a genuine, easy smile, and went right back to playing with his Legos. He didn't hold on to the past with a white-knuckled grip the way I did. And maybe that's exactly where forgiveness starts. Not with amnesia, and not with excuses, but with the conscious choice to leave the past exactly where it belongs, behind us. So, when people ask me now if I've forgiven my family, I give them the only honest answer I have. They are learning. I am healing. Time will tell. And for right now, that is enough.